Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Business and Society podcast, where we discuss ideas at the intersection of business and society. I'm your host, Senthil, and in today's episode, we will discuss monopoly and market power. I'm excited to be joined by Matt Stoller, Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project, who will chat with us today about monopolies and market concentration. Matt is the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, which Business Insider called one of the year's best books on how to rethink capitalism and improve the economy. He also worked for a member of the Financial Services Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives during the financial crisis. His writing has appeared in various outlets, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. Stoller writes the monopoly-focused newsletter Big, which has tens of thousands of subscribers. Warm welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, let's begin with your personal story. You graduated from Harvard, worked at a software startup, and served on a congressman's staff. You produced a show for MSNBC and later became a writer and actor in a television series. In 2015, you took on the role of policy advisor for the Senate Budget Committee. Subsequently, you joined Open Markets and later co-founded the American Economic Liberties Project. It seems for the past decade or so, your career is centered around tackling monopolies and market concentration.
Right.
What led you to dedicate a career to tackling monopoly power?
Yeah. Right. You can go through a bunch of bullshit jobs I've had in the past. I don't know. I mean, I'm a political hack, so I'm interested in politics. You know, people are interested in different things in this world. I happen to love politics, which to me it doesn't mean, rooting for a political party. It means the art of forming a society out of different people who have different views and different ideas, often with a shared heritage or shared kind of sense of community, but with different views on kind of what they want. And I think it's a really beautiful thing that people can come together and disagree, but also build a society. So I got interested in that. And I think in my lifetime, and I'm fairly old at this point, I have generally seen America, an American government, make poor decisions. Not always, but often. And not just American government writ large, but business, large businesses like Boeing or Google or whatever. They're not doing a very good job of kind of being as stewards of a society. And sometimes they're not even doing a good job of making money. And so I kind of got interested in this problem of why we're failing at our politics, why we're failing to create a society. And that I got interested in it during the Iraq War in 2002, 2003, the debates over that, and then the war itself. And then I got increasingly interested in it during the financial crisis. And ultimately, what I kind of came to conclude was that the what has gone wrong in our ability to form a society, because America has done a very good job in general, going back to the founding, really even going back to the colonial period. And what happened is we just sort of put too much power in too few hands. And that's generally true in the commercial realm. And so what you have is a situation where there's a few people that have decision-making authority over way too much. And while you can, while there are some people who are very smart and very competent, doesn't matter how smart and competent you are, you only have 24 hours in a day. And so you can only run so much. And I think that the fact that we have consolidated economic and political power into a small group of people who just can't manage it is why other people feel disempowered, is why things keep misfiring, is why we keep putting huge resources into kind of white elephant projects that don't go anywhere, and ultimately why we're kind of ruining ourselves as a society. And so that's kind of what I got interested in, and the basis of the law that's supposed to prohibit these kinds of concentrations is the ideological sort of tip of the spear is antitrust and anti-monopoly politics. So that's kind of where I eventually came to focus my time and energy.
There are many practitioners out there who fight monopolies and corporate power, academicians and people such as you. What I found different in your work is the urgency you show to address market concentration. What makes you believe monopoly power is such an urgent issue?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the systems, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's bad and unfair. There's inequality, there's lots of, worse consumer products and, lower wages and blah, 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 blah. But, and then you can make your lefty argument about that, or you can make a conservative argument about how it's undermining that, institutions like the church or local communities. But the broad problem, I think, that makes it most urgent is the fact that we are increasingly seeing the systems on which we rely to stay alive break down. So that would be things like shortages, right? So in the US right now, we have a big egg shortage. And the reason we have an egg shortage is because we have allowed the roll up of egg production into the hands of a few companies. And and they make more money when there's a shortage than when there's not. And so, we have an avian flu problem, which is killing a lot of chickens. But the thing is that they're not really replacing their flocks to lay more eggs, because why would they want to? Egg prices are really high. And if they can restrain the production of eggs, then they will make more money um, than if they produce more eggs. So there was an economist for the United Egg Producers who said, more hens, less income. And he wrote this in 1994. And this was the basis for a conspiracy that they organized. And that's sort of, in one form or another, likely still going on. That's really scary, not because eggs are necessary. Obviously you can go on without eggs. But if you have a shortage of vital foodstuffs, and if you have enough shortages, you get a famine, right? And so we've had shortages in this country of baby formula, of eggs, and of a whole host of materials from, like during the COVID era, you know, everything from chicken patties to black piping. But even outside of COVID, we have really serious shortages of inexpensive pharmaceuticals that have been shortages for since 2012, or actually the mid 2000s. Things like really cheap cancer drugs, and these are a result of the consolidation of power and the consolidation of production in just a few factories. And if you have one factory making something and that factory then has to be closed down, you won't have any more of it. And that's what we see over and over in lots of different vital areas. And so I think that's what creates the urgency. And just to give like a very obvious example of how our systems are breaking down, we all in sort of the world I'm in, you sometimes take trips and you fly places, and you're basically going to be on a Boeing plane or an Airbus plane. And it's really scary to be on a Boeing plane now. I mean, Boeing used to be the gold standard. Like the phrase was, if it ain't Boeing, I'm not going, right? Because it was the world-class engineers who made planes safely, carefully, profitably. And now, who knows, right? I mean, they're not even making money, right? But the planes don't, the quality is bad or worse than it should be. And so if you, the same trends that hit Boeing, legal trends, kind of are hitting every company in America. And so that's really scary, because it means that the systems that we use to make the things we need to keep us alive are breaking down. And that's where I think the urgency is coming from.
Interesting you cited Boeing. Is there a history that they blocked new entrants into the sector, or it's a high capex business and it's not that people like me or someone go and start a aircraft manufacturing venture, or the industry set up as such that stopped competition?
Yeah, I mean they did block someone from getting into the sector, which was in the 90s. There was a merger. McDonnell Douglas, we had two aerospace producers. So there's been, a bunch of aerospace producers. I think Lockheed was making passenger jets, and McDonnell Douglas was. There was a bunch of them, and they kind of gradually consolidated. And in 1990s, the government encouraged consolidation in the defense space, which included McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, and those were the last two civilian aerospace manufacturers. And there was an antitrust case, and there was a huge political fight over whether these two companies would be able to consolidate. And McDonnell Douglas was sort of the last I mean, their business was kind of ebbing, right? They weren't very good at making civilian aircraft, but they were still making them. And Boeing both bought McDonnell Douglas and signed long-term contracts with the airlines, which meant that it was going to be impossible for anyone else to enter into the business. Not that it would have been easy, but if McDonnell Douglas had been forced to sell their civilian aircraft production unit to someone else, that could have capitalized it a little bit more. I mean, they had a business that was going, and they could have, we could have had more than one producer. Instead, it was consolidated into one producer, and McDonnell Douglas people were bad at making aircraft. They were financiers, and Boeing decided to adopt the McDonnell Douglas strategy for a variety of reasons. And so immediately after that merger, there was a fight between the financial guys and the engineers ended up losing. And so that just destroyed, because Boeing was now a domestic, was a domestic monopoly. It was the only domestic aerospace producer. It ended up ruining our entire aerospace industry. Now, there is a rival now, or potential rival. It's not a rival, but it's a potential rival. It's called Boom Supersonic. And Boom Supersonic's been around since, I think, 2014. They make supersonic aircraft. And I believe United has sort of pledged to buy 30 of those, their jets or something like that. So there is long-term financing for the space if somebody wanted to get into it and said, I'm going to compete with Boeing. But it's not like the government is encouraging that, and it's not like we're making it easy for a new entrant to get in. You could say, all right, Boeing, you have to let others come in and repair your aircraft. That might be like the first way in. I mean, there are ways that we could sort of help to diversify the market a little bit. We're never going to have 7 aircraft producers, but you could have more than one. If you wanted to. And we just have decided that that's not something that we really care about. And we've also decided that, we're not going to really force the people at Boeing to fix the situation. And that's really puzzling to me, since it does seem like a lot of the people that are kind of just letting things grind into dust also fly places. It's just weird, right? So anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
It's such a fascinating story. I think that's a good segue to discuss your book, which has abundant stories about the history of monopolies and market concentration. I learned about it from Peter Goodman of the New York Times, who appeared on this podcast and recommended your book to our listeners. I must say the book is very special, particularly for taking the readers to some of the dark corners of business and politics in the past century. Would you give a quick summary of the book? I think it's more relevant now than 2018 or 19 when you released it.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. It's nice to hear that it's held up. So the story is about kind of the three, here's one way to characterize it. The 3 paths when you build industrial power, right? In the early 20th century, there's this amazing, coal and oil and telegraphs and telephones and cars and all of the implications for modern weaponry. You have this immense power, right, that we have discovered as humans, engineering and scientific capacity. And how do you control it, right, politically, to do politics? And there are 3 different paths. And one path is to have the state control it all, and that would be like the communist path. And that's the path the USSR went down. And then you have the let private actors that are consolidated, let private monopolies kind of run things, or fuse private monopolies in the state. And that was the Mussolini fascist path that veered into Nazism, right? And then you had, but they kind of Mussolini modeled what he was doing after Teddy Roosevelt's ideas, although not the murdering opposition, but just how do you control this power? And then you have the sort of liberal democratic path, which is what the New Deal was about, which is, okay, we're gonna try to allow for this immense innovation and capacity in industrialization, but we're going to try to control it by fostering regulated competition. And my book is about the fight to do that over the 20th century and focusing on, in America, right? So Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are sort of the specters of the outside, but it takes place in America, and it's about this congressman named Wright Patman, loosely, right? Like it follows his life, but a little bit before, a little bit after, who was in Congress from 1929 to 1976. So a really long time in Congress. when the U.S. built the modern middle class, and then right after traces how what he did to attack the consolidation of power in the banks and in the rest of the economy, how that did things like helped create Silicon Valley, helped create modern telecommunications, and then what happens afterwards, right? After his legacy gets taken apart by the Democrats and the Republicans in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and where that led us as a kind of explanation of why we're seeing some of the trends that we saw in kind of early 20th century, both in the US and abroad, like those are sort of reemerging. And it's kind of just like an explanation of why. And the book came for me, it's like I started writing it because I was working as a staffer during the financial crisis in the House of Representatives. And it was very weird to me that there was just not this awareness of a dormant or of this anti-monopoly tradition in the US. And the all of the agencies that we were dealing with to deal with the crisis, like the Federal Reserve and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, all the alphabet agencies that come in and handle bailouts and banks and stuff, that was all built during the FDR time, or at least the modern versions of it were. And so there was just no historical understanding of why they were built and the anti-monopoly principles that were baked into them. And so I thought, this is really weird. I don't know anything about this. And I just sort of was like, I'm going to study it. And out of that came a book and a story of, I think, what was a dormant and important tradition that's coming back, because we're starting to see the problems, not starting. We've been seeing the problems that came out of the collapse of those institutions and the anti-monopoly principles that were embedded in them in the 80s, 90s, and so on.
That's superb, and I don't think we'll do justice by getting into the details of the book into this 40 minutes podcast. But one key takeaway from reading your book for me is the time it took to dislodge the ecosystem that helps build monopolies. Take Andrew Mellon, or Melonism, you wrote about. It took quite a few years to decisively control his influence. Do you think people or societies have the stamina today, especially when multiple crises such as climate change, geopolitics, information overload compete for society's attention?
It's really up to us. I mean, that's the thing is that this is a story that every society has to go through in every culture, and always had to go through. Like, we get to choose as human beings what kind of world we live in. Now, obviously, we're bounded by our traditions and path dependence. If you're, if it's 2000 BC and you're an Egyptian peasant, like you don't have a lot of agency, right? But we are, I think, at least I am in a position where I'm the honor of living in a democracy, and I believe it's incumbent on all of us to advocate for the society that we want to live in. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because, America, it's hard to have a republic, but we pretty much kept one from the 1770s until the 1970s. I mean, there were obviously like significant exceptions to that. We did have a fascist South for a fair amount of time, and slavery and segregation. And there were a lot of really exceptions would be one way to put it, but there are countervailing themes in American history as well. But, we've done it before, and we've done it for most of our history. So the idea that we can't do it now is I don't buy that. I don't think human nature changes. I think Louis Brandeis, I guess I'll close with this quote. He said, "The longing for freedom is ineradicable, and it will express itself in protest against injustice, unless the longing itself for injustice is made to seem immoral." Right? So people naturally want liberty. I think at least that's what Americans kind of naturally want, and you have to spend a lot of effort suppressing it. Right? And that's why it's like, I think if we just recognize that and say, what, our longing for liberty is legitimate, and we should execute on that in terms of policy. I don't think it'll take that much time to take the dominant firms and oligarchs, to bring them back into our democracy. I just think we have to want to do it.
When it comes to fighting market concentration or monopoly power, what is the one lesson from the last 100 years we must not forget? There's abundant stories, as I said, very, very vivid. But if you tell our listeners that let's not forget this from the last 100 years, what is it?
So I guess what I would say is there is a really big difference between doing business and empire building, right? And I think what we've gotten into for a variety of reasons. There is this perception that if you are saying we should promote business but not empire building, then you are anti-business, right? Like one of the things I want to break up Google because I think Google is a holding company that is restraining the different parts of Google, right? There's a lot of great people, very talented within Google, who are constrained by Google's like overwhelming bureaucracy, all the bullshit meetings they have to go to. And that's true in most big corporations. Most big corporations spend a lot of time trying to make sure their employees don't do anything, right? And bury that. It's like a big government, right? That's what they are. And when we want to there's this sort of traditional lefty frame, which is those big companies are bad. They need to share the wealth. And that's not where I come at it. I am a lefty, but I don't think, oh, they have too much money. We should share some of that money. I think they are limiting human freedom because there's a few people making decisions when there's a lot of people in that place who are potential leaders and should be able to lead and potentially do things, right? And so I think that traditionally we would look at a company like Google and say this is a private government. It has 15 products with more than 500 million users. Why can't some of those be independent businesses? Why can't they cut deals with lots of other companies? Why do they have to make all their deals internally, right? Preference their own products. That's a waste. And like that to me is a pro business argument. And the antitrust law, the Sherman Act says that we prohibit restraints of trade, which says don't, take trade and stop restraining it. It is fundamentally about doing more business. And I think people sometimes confuse the idea of doing more business with empire building, right? Google buys another company or gets bigger, and therefore it's more business. But in fact, it's just restraining trade. And I think that's we have to realize that how we do business, how we structure business is a political question. And we have to make the distinction between building more business and creating more business and just empire building.
It's a very interesting answer, Matt. Before we talk about market concentration today, I just want to ask you some of the ideas you have shared is applicable just for the United States, or it's a phenomenon that you have observed in other parts of the world as well?
I mean, I think in general, everyone uses Google except if you're in like China or Turkey or a couple of other Russia. Like, there's a couple of places where Google is not dominant, but most of the world, you're using Google, right? You're using Meta. You're using, Amazon's not dominant everywhere, but it has presence in a lot of places. And I think what you would see is, there's two companies. I mean, across the board, I'm bringing big tech, but there's a lot of companies that control vital infrastructure. So I believe there's like three main companies that do seeds and chemicals for like everyone for all farmers, right? There are two companies, they're both European companies that manage the chicken genetics that produce the best egg laying hens, right? And they handle 90% of chicken genetics in the world. And you see this kind of across the board where market power is really the governing system of most of the world, right? Acquiring and wielding market power. Not in I don't want to say not in China, because China has their own political strategy. Some of it involves either having their own dominant market power companies, but they're sort of a slightly different economic model. So the answer is that it is probably most extreme in the U.S., but it is a global dynamic.
Actually, you answered my next question. I wanted to ask you, could you give us examples of a few sectors where market concentration is rife and how it impacts societies? Because we often hear terms such as big tech, big food, big oil, big pharma. Right. I'm just wondering, is it an exaggeration or is market concentration a problem across sectors?
I think it's across sectors. I mentioned that there are shortages of cheap cancer drugs before, those shortages are actually worldwide. And there are, I think what you see is, the model, the economic development model for at least since the 1970s has been to consolidate economic power and globalize it. And I mean, I think what the reason, and this isn't like a bunch of bad people got together and was like, aha, we'll consolidate everything. It was that in the 1970s, the kind of post World War II order, which was run by, really, it was based off of the New Deal. It was the domestic New Deal in the US, which was a lot of public control over markets, and then expanded through the world through control over currency flows and global trade arrangements. That was kind of breaking down, and you had financial instability, and you had inflation, and so there was a debate about what to do, right? And what do we do about this problem? And I think the argument from a lot of uh, philosophers and political thinkers on the right and the left for different reasons, but they basically said, look, um, the problem we have is that we are penalizing companies that are big, and we are penalizing capital. There was something called the capital shortage, right? If I want to invest and make more stuff and build a factory, I'm not able to do that because of these constraints on capital. And that in turn generates inflation because I can't make as much stuff as I would want to, too much money chasing too few goods. Therefore, what we should do is relax restrictions on capital, on terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of mergers and acquisitions. And no, I know you think that if a company is really big, that it's probably dangerous. There's probably conflicts of interest. There's probably too much power. Those are traditional pre-1980 principles of managing American business. But actually, what's really going on is they're just really good at what they do. That's why they're big, right? General Motors is the biggest, automaker in the world because it's just really good at making cars, right? Um, IBM's the biggest computer maker in the world because it's really good at making computers, right? This is 1970s and 80s, right? And so they said we should change the laws to encourage bigness so that we can have the best people making the most stuff, make it more efficient. And so they did that, and then globalized that concept. And it was not just an American thing. A lot of Europeans bought it. A lot of people in other countries around the world bought into it. And so it was a global arrangement where people said, yeah, actually, we need to have bigger, more efficient enterprises, and we need to encourage a lot more capital flows and not put restrictions on capital because that causes all sorts of problems. And so what we have now is a world where you have very large enterprises managing our key social resources, and you have lots of capital flows with no restraints on them. And that's caused its own problems. And that's where we are now.
You subtly touched upon a point. If we look at some sectors, say aircraft manufacturing, for example, where businesses that demands very high capex, consolidation is accompanied by high profits and barriers to entry. However, there are also cases where companies make better margins due to product differentiation and personalization. For example, a pharma company that makes pills for weight loss. Is it something wrong with the latter? What if a business solves my problem better than its rivals and commands a premium for it? Isn't it all businesses aspire for, though the unintended consequence of this may be a market dominance?
Sorry. So what you're saying is if a company is really good at what they're doing and they make a lot of money, isn't that good? Is that sort of the gist of what you're saying?
My gist is that there are businesses that build barriers to entry and make these artificial boundaries where others cannot enter. But there are certain businesses that they're really good at their game in solving consumers' problem, and they command premium for it. This is what they teach you in marketing 101.
Yeah.
And just
No, okay. I got you. And Google is a good example, right? And one of the interesting things is that sometimes it's hard to tell. Like Google was a great company, did a lot of innovation. I was a Google user in 1998 when they came out, and I was like, this is amazing. It's so different and better. And then, it was great for a really long time. And but it's 2025, right? And at a certain point between 1998 and 2025, it sort of stopped being just powerful because it was a great search engine, and it started being powerful because it was engaged in all sorts of coercive practices to not let new entrants into the market. Now, where that line is, it's not clear, right? But I think one way to measure the problem you're talking about is is the durability of high profit margins, right? So if a company is just very profitable because they create a new product category, right, or they solve a particularly hard problem, and they make a lot of money, good for you, right? You should make a lot of money being able to do that. Like Ford Motor figures out mass production. That's awesome, right? We should want that. But when the profit margins are durable, high and durable, that's when we know there's a problem. Because if someone's making a lot of money in a market system where you allow new entrants, you're going to see people copy. They're going to come in and be like, you're doing that good thing that people like. I'm going to come in and I'm going to capture some of your margin. I'm going to do it, but sell it cheaper. I'm going to do it better and sell it for the same price or whatever it is. You see product differentiation, as you noted, or you see, lower margin products, but in America right now, I don't know if this is a global thing, but I would assume it is. Our companies today are older, they're bigger, and they're more profitable in terms of pervasive profits than they have been, I think, almost ever, right? I mean, it's just like if you're a big company and old and you're very profitable, like that's like the standard US model of a company. And it's not that they're producing like awesome stuff anymore. They're just have market power, and it's really hard for someone else to get into the market because, whatever, you're a cereal company and you control, you have deals with Walmart and Target to control the shelf space. And so you're just like, yeah, you can, it's effectively a commodity, but you have a deal to block others from getting in, right? Or other forms of distribution. So that's how I'd answer it, which is that like, hey, most monopolies, not all, but a lot of them start off by doing something different and better, and then they become slothful and just prevent others from getting into the market. But a barrier to entry that's just my product is awesome is not a barrier to entry. It's just a better product, and we shouldn't I mean, this is why antitrust cases are sometimes difficult, because that's what they argue. They're like, our product is just better, right? It's not a barrier to entry. But that's why we have laws that sort of set up procedures to tell the difference between a company that's being unfair and a company that is just like making really good stuff.
Interesting, you touched upon tech companies as examples, and there are arguments out there that the network effects that comes with these tech companies builds this natural ecosystem barriers to entry. Have you ever thought of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the basis for, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I would say like, okay, just on a very basic level, you could make an argument that Google search is a company, or is a line of business that gets better when they have more data and more users, right? So there are network effects there. And you could argue that, like, say, Gmail is the same thing, or that YouTube is the same thing. But I don't think there's an argument that having search and video sharing in the same company has some sort of network effect. That's just a legal arrangement. They just choose to merge the two of them. So it's like, okay, Google, I said, had 15 products with more than 500 million users. Maybe each of those products has a network effect, but not across products, right? So there's a sort of like overstatement of that dynamic. And I just want two more points. One is network effects don't have to be contained within a corporation. So what is the biggest network in existence? It would be the internet, right? And no one owns the internet. And it is the biggest network in existence because no one owns it. Anybody can connect to it. So the idea that like you need to have one company own the network for someone to take advantage of the operational scale is not true, right? Actually, in 1994, 95, Robert Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, or maybe the NEC director at the time, anyway, somebody brought him a copy of Netscape and showed him the internet. And he said, who owns this? This is amazing. Who owns this? And they were like, no one owns it. And he couldn't believe it, right? And I think that's where there's a little bit of a dynamic where people are like, well, somebody got to own the network for it to scale. But that's not true. And it's never been true. We can have all sorts of institutional arrangements. We can have data sharing. We can have, network sharing. You can have like those scale, the benefits of scale do not have to be captured by a corporation. And then the third point I'll make is that there are a number of competition lawsuits, antitrust suits in the U.S. against companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, Meta, and the Google one I'll talk about because that one there's actually been a verdict, and Google was found liable for being a monopolist. Like they lost the case, although there hasn't been a remedy yet. But the argument from the government, the successful argument, was Google uses its economies of scale to make a better search engine, right? Data, if I use Google and I search for something, then they know what I'm searching for and they know what I click on. So then if you search for the same thing, they now have my track record and they know, oh, people that search for that thing tend to click on this thing. We'll move that up, right? So their search engine gets better. That is a competitive advantage versus other search engines. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it illegal to use that data. But what does make it, what became unlawful, is Google pays companies like Apple or Mozilla or Verizon or Samsung to not put other search engines on their products as defaults. So what they're trying to do is deny rivals the data and the scale that they have. So it's not that, so it's like Google pays Apple $20 billion a year purely to deny Microsoft's Bing from getting access to those users and that data. So scale exists and it's an important attribute of business, but it's also a weapon for a monopolist to deny scale to their rival. And we see this over and over in lots of different areas. So those are the arguments I would make about scale.
Such a great answer, Matt. I'll ask one last question before we move to the final section. What do you see as the future of business influence on politics? New York Times recently wrote the following about President Trump's inauguration, and I quote, "Three men collectively worth close to $1 trillion were seated in front of Trump's cabinet bigs and behind his family, creating what might be a hierarchy of influence."
Right. So typically when people say business influence on government, what they mean is corruption, right? And getting secret, getting cronies and favors and stuff like that. And I think the question of business influence on government is broader, right? Because it's a little bit like, all right, government, I talked about empire building versus actually doing business. Now, if the government is coming in and saying, we're going to help set up markets, we're going to help encourage more semiconductor production, or we're going to, try to restrict fentanyl or whatever it is, like those are all business arrangements, right? Those are all things that government is trying to do. And they will often go to business people and say, hey, how do we encourage more production of blah, 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 whatever it is. Last night, Trump established an office of shipbuilding, right? Because the U.S. has no merchant marine. So we need to go build ships. And that's, and I'm sure there's a bunch of maritime people that have been encouraging the government to do that. And the government is going to go to them and be like, how do we build more ships? That's good. That's not a bad thing. That's not corruption. That's just the government structuring what kind of business and how we're going to do business, right? But the question of cronyism and just how can government help us build more empires and capture more commerce that we then get to tax, that is really bad. And that's what I think what you saw at the inauguration, where you have a monopolist like a Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or a Sundar Pichai or an Elon Musk. Like those guys are Musk's a little more complicated, but with Starlink and SpaceX is a pretty strong monopoly. Those guys have captured control of businesses that they effectively tax. And what they want is for the government and their private governments, that's what Amazon is, to kind of collude on either preserving their empires or expanding their empires. And that I think is really bad and really dangerous. I think the government should be trying to prevent empire building in private markets as opposed to encourage it. I can't say that, some people on the right would say that those guys were not there because they were powerful. They were there because they were surrendering to Trump. So, don't worry, Trump is not going to do what Amazon wants or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever. I don't have an answer to that, but I will just say that that's an alternative argument, an alternative view.
Matt, let's move to the segment How I Did It, where I ask all my guests 3 personal questions to draw lessons from their life and career. how do you handle differences of opinion or setbacks?
Among who?
With the people you work, your peers, or you said you're a lefty. I'm sure there will be right wingers who come with different set of view. How do you manage
How do
them?
I handle disagreements in general?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I guess is there. I would have two observations about that. So if I think if somebody has really studied a topic and they know what they're talking about, they've done the work, and they come to a different conclusion, then I think it's worth listening to them and learning from them, because oftentimes they'll have objections that are worth taking seriously. Maybe it's worth changing your mind about it, right? If they can say, "Here's a thing that you haven't considered," um, then you need to deal with that. Sometimes they are just spending a lot of time trying to find ways of lying. You do have to know how they're portraying the situation, just so you can understand how they're trying to wield political power. But if the point is that if they're doing a lot of work to try to persuade you of something and they have a substantive knowledge, whether it's honest or not, then you have to take them seriously. If they haven't done that work, I don't really believe in engaging. I don't think that and there's a lot of superficial garbage. And I don't know how to, and a lot of prestigious people who engage in superficial garbage. I don't really know how to deal with that, but that's one observation. And then the other observation about how to handle disagreement is that, I have what I call a zone of reasonableness, right? Which is that, if you're making a strategic call, right, or making an observation, you're basically making a guess about the future. Okay. And there are lots of ways. We don't know what the future is going to bring, and we don't know who's going to be right about anything. So what I look for in this is just working with allies, but also, people I oppose to, if they're making a guess and it's not the guess I make, but it's reasonable, it is potentially going to come true. And I could be wrong, right? And they might be right, but it's a reasonable guess. I'm willing to cut them slack. And I'm willing to say, well, you might be right, and I don't know, and we'll see, right? But if it's unreasonable, if it's and this is arbitrary where I draw that line, but if I'm just like, you clearly haven't done the work, and you're just doing this because of some other reason, or you just haven't done the work, and you don't know how this thing actually works, and it's just not going to it's not going to work out that way, then I will sort of dispute them. But if they're in the zone of reasonableness and they have a different view about where to go, then I think it's worth listening, and I think it's worth just cutting them slack and saying, maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong.
Interesting. What would your advice be to business leaders? If I say give one or two advice, what would it be?
So I think that we have a really serious crisis within American business right now. Maybe global business, I'm not sure, but American business, what you see is the Chinese EV producers are much better than ours. They're better at a lot of stuff, even things we put a lot of money into, like AI. DeepSeek comes out and embarrasses everyone. I think there's a Boeing, a Ticketmaster, we're losing the operational capacity to actually do business. And I think the reason is because we have a vision of business that is really finance driven. And the finance guys are in there. And what they're saying is we need to be radically efficient. We need to thin out our supply lines. We need to fire people. We need to thin out as much cost as possible, right? And for a while, that might make sense, right? If you're trying to lose weight, you do want to lose fat. You do want to eat less. But at a certain point, you are just starving yourself. And I think one of the things that's happened is instead of getting lean and then building muscle, what we've done is just started cutting into muscle, cutting into bone. And so we're just really understaffed at key things. And we're letting the finance guys just run businesses into the ground. That's what Boeing was. But you see this across every corporate procurement department. Everybody can tell you that the finance guys are claiming fake savings and really costs are exploding. You can see this in engineering departments. They're doing things that are stupid. Like they're saying, oh, you have to fill out a lot more forms for our engineers to use a hotel room that saves us some money. And it's like, then your engineers are spending their time filling out forms for a hotel room for travel instead of engineering, right? So there's a lot of short-term thinking and cost bloat. And I think that the reason is because business leaders are afraid to make decisions that cut against the finance brain and saying, no, we're going to spend more money to make better products, and that's going to save us money in the long term. That's going to give us better pricing power in the long term. Instead, they are just sort of like, no, if I have a problem, I'm going to bring in Booz Allen or whoever to like come in and do a 6-month engagement rather than building internal capacity. And since nobody ever gets fired for bringing in Booz Allen, it doesn't matter. We'll spend a lot of money on them. And it doesn't matter if they come up with like a decision everybody ignores, or, there's just a lack of courage and a lack of willingness to kind of go against the grain. But there are a lot of really, I think the people that are going to be successful in business are going to be the ones who are a little bit more farsighted and are willing to make investments and are willing to ignore the kind of the calls for thinning things out that we've been hearing since the 1980s. So, I mean, I really feel like rebuilding the foundations of American business is a core is a core objective that I think business leaders. I mean, you see this like. I think Boom Aerospace is a really interesting company. I've seen Mike Beckham from Simple Modern is doing a lot of really interesting. They make the metal cups that are, everybody has one now for water, and he just reshored a lot of his production and from China, and it's just like a really interesting new way of doing. And they're making a ton of money. And Epic Games has been in a lawsuit with Apple over the App Store. So rather than ignoring or trying to get in bed with a monopolist, he's just fought them. And I think they're going to make a lot of money off of it and make better products. So there's like there is a different way of doing business that is about breaking empires as opposed to building them. And I think that's really where if I had advice for business people, that's kind of where I would push them.
Finally, Matt, can you recommend a book or two to our listeners? Do you read a lot?
I do, although I haven't written. I have a young daughter, so I've not had much time to read as I used to. Well, okay, so there's a lot of books that are great. So obviously, I mean, read Goliath. My book is really good. If you want to understand antitrust, I think there's a short book by Tim Wu called The Curse of Bigness. And it's good. It'll get you through the principles and the history, and it's a fun read. If you want to read a novel, I just read a really good book that just came out by a guy named Cory Doctorow called Picks and Shovels, which is about a fight in the computer industry in the early 80s, but it actually will teach you a lot about policy, but it's fun. It's a novel. It's a thriller. And if you want... let's see here. I mean, there's a lot of great work coming out about monopoly power. I will say if you want an academic book on the history of American telecommunications, which is fascinating and really fun, about innovation, like how innovation really happened. There's a historian named Richard John who wrote a book called Network Nation, and it's about the 19th century creation of AT&T and Western Union, patent law, anti-monopoly laws. Fascinating and fun. And then the last one would be that I'll recommend is T.J. Stiles' The First Tycoon, The Life and Times of Cornelius Vanderbilt, which is about really, it's a biography of the first, I guess, billionaire type in America, but it's basically a story of industrialization and law in America in the 19th century. And it is wonderful. So there's a bunch of books. I like fun reads. I think that's like the way to go. And those are 4.
Excellent. Matt, I think that's all the time we have for today. And thank you so much. What a pleasure speaking to you and listening to your path-breaking perspectives.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me. Have a good one.
Thank you so much for tuning and listening to our podcast today. When you get a chance, please do not forget to leave a rating and review of this podcast. And feel free to write to me if you have any thoughts or comments or what kind of episodes you'd love to hear in the future. Thank you so much.